Hello, everyone. We are going to start at the top here. When wildfire hits, mutual aid, climate justice, racial justice, and organizing in crisis. These two organizations, Rogue Climate and Rogue Action Center, were a couple of organizations locally who had been doing different kinds of justice work up before the fires. And as the fires hit, we found ourselves in unique positions, having already organized and having large networks of volunteers and organizations. We found ourselves in a position to really hit the ground and start helping out with the community in the hours after the fire. So we're going to kind of talk through that a little bit, what this last year has been like for us, and how we got help from other folks and other organizations. So to start, we are gonna head to this next slide here. And Sara.
Hi. Just wanted to recognize and take a second. Here where the fire started, we're on the Takelma territory here in the Rogue Valley. The Almeida Fire first took place on traditional lands of the Takelma and Shasta people in 1856. The U.S. government forcibly relocated the Takelma people and survived the Rogue Valley Indian Wars of the Salites Reservation and the Grand Radon Indian Reservation here in Northwest Oregon. And just want to take a second to recognize that and the land that was affected by the fire and all that good stuff. And then we'll jump to Elib.
Yeah, I think it's been a pretty traumatic year for a lot of us around here, and the topic of fire comes up and the smoke in the valley, and we all kind of, bristle a little bit. But I really want to take a moment. Someone reminded me recently of just the regenerative power of the fire as well in general, and how vital it is for our ecosystem, for our planet, and how to be careful not to villainize the fire itself, but the land practices that have led to this situation, global climate change, global climate collapse, and these are the real culprits and not the fire itself. So on September 8th, about 11 o'clock in the morning, a fire started in Ashland, Oregon. There were winds of about gusts of 50 miles an hour, sustained winds of 25 to 30 that pushed this fire down along Bear Creek and into the towns of Talent and Phoenix, where many folks along the creek there were living in trailer park communities. And it was an incredible afternoon to be evacuated from my home in Ashland, to then go to where my kids were at their mom's house in Talent, to be evacuated from there, to drive through town with burning structures on both sides of the road. And like many folks, both communities really, most folks had to evacuate their home. And it was a really, as you can imagine, intense couple of days there as the fire burned through town. And one of the reasons that it's important to share this, and one of the things that we're realizing now, having been involved in this sustained mutual aid effort for over a year, is just hoping to let folks know what our experience was, what are some of the things that we came up against, what were some of the obstacles, what are some of the things that we learned. And so even though most folks in town's homes didn't burn, this was something that affected the entire community. And so as you are thinking about what you might be doing to prepare, it's not only preparing for folks who have lost homes, but preparing for the fact that many people are going to be outside of their homes. They may not have water, they may not have electricity for many days, like some of us did. And so this is another aspect to the disaster that we came up against that we needed to try and figure out how to solve. So yeah, the streets were closed down, and it was hard for folks to get in to the towns of Talent and Phoenix. And so the folks at Rogue Action Center and Rogue Climate who were living within the burn zone realized that there were many folks that were really isolated. As the National Guard and municipalities kind of cut off access to these towns, it meant that nothing was able to get in. And so the networks within those communities became really important. And so a couple of mutual aid stations were set up in the front yards of some of the folks within our two organizations. And it was there that kind of this mutual aid effort started. And other efforts similar to that were popping up in different areas around the community, in front of the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, at Living Waters Church in Medford, a parking lot in Talent, in front of the Home Depot where many fire affected folks had gathered. And within, by the end of the day, folks had organized this group of ad hoc aid stations and was already beginning to talk about what are the resources that were needed, what did one site have that the other site might need, and the quick organization of this was really helpful in those very first hours after the fire. And Rogue Climate and Rogue Action Center already had these networks of volunteers. They had text bank lists already together and were really quickly able to get out through those networks what it is that was needed in the beginning hours of that fire. Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, it was pretty crazy how quick Rogue Climate, because of our contact list, like we were able to like reach out to people like that night and start checking in on how people were doing physically and mentally and spiritually. But right after the fires hit, the whole area was a disaster. That right after it was put out, like it was pretty much called like a no livable zone. There were still houses that were, even after the fire, there were still houses that were even able, like still on their feet, that families weren't able to go back to because of the affected area. Power was shut off for areas that didn't even burn down. There was a boil water notice. There were large amounts of no running water, even though the houses that didn't burn, it was like not drinkable because of different pipes bursting into like the pressure from the water when the fire department came. There was police blockades and National Guard that only came to make sure people wouldn't get into their neighborhoods, which was really, really disappointing because there was probably pieces that people wanted to keep in like memorabilia for them for their own sentimental personal reasons. And it was a pretty big impact in our community, and a lot of families were definitely traumatized, not only by the fires, but by not being able to get having enough time to get the things they loved and had carried throughout their generations. And I'll pass it back to Elib. Sorry, Elib, you're muted.
I apologize. I'm on a funky tablet that doesn't like this program, so I apologize. So here are some of the supplies that were gathered in one of these pop-up sites. Water obviously was a really big need right off the bat. Cell phone charging was a really big need for folks to be able to get in touch with their family, many of whom were spread out in different evacuation points throughout the valley. And we just started taking food and toiletries, and folks were being directed to these homes where these supplies had been gathered. The mutual aid efforts in front of these homes lasted for 2 or 3 days. And one of the larger efforts was in front of the Home Depot parking lot, which is right in the middle of where the burn zone was actually, and many displaced folks were gathering in that parking lot. And some folks from the Talent Phoenix School District started pulling up and had gathered supplies. They cleaned out the cafeteria at the school, for example, and brought all of the meals to Home Depot. And it was really the effort of those teachers that became the mutual aid site where we ended up running for the last 11 and a half months. It was really the effort of these teachers and the school district that really got this moving, and they stepped in and started organizing and connecting with the other folks in the valley who were gathering supplies. And at one point, the Home Depot said they had to leave, and so they moved right across the freeway to a strip mall, the Shops at 24 in Phoenix, Oregon, which is where the mutual aid site has been operating. And in those first few days, it was really an incredible thing to be a part of the ad hoc coordinated effort between these various organizations. I spent the first couple days just loading my car up from one donation site and driving to another with size 5 diapers and picking up bottles of water and taking them to another location. And was just so impressive to see how organized that became so quickly. And the signal groups that were set up became just a vital means of communication across all of these different efforts. And really, over the course of the next 3-4 weeks, a month, really coalesced into some really established networks and organizations that have been just so vital all throughout this time here in Southern Oregon. And Sada, take it away.
Yeah, as you can, the fires impacted, obviously within those trailer parks, there's a lot of low income, Latinx, Indigenous, and communities of color and elders, first and worst. As you can see, like the pictures right here shown, there's a lot of trailas there where a lot of like first generation families were born and raised and where they put their roots down, and it was pretty intense, especially with working at the fire mutual aid site. I talked to primarily all those families, and we went canvassing and then going to the FEMA parks, and a lot of those people who lived in Phoenix being placed all the way out in White City, and majority of their work or family and friends being on this side of town. It became a big barrier and made them feel even worse after the fire because they didn't have their regular neighbors and friends and family around them to give them that support, and they just lost a lot of disconnection happened, and everyone always constantly told Elib and I and everyone else at the fire site that they wanted things to go back to normal. They just wanted their own lives back, but obviously things like we can always come back from things like this, but not back to how things used to be. We evolve and we change and we adapt, but it was crazy just to know how the fire started in Ashland, where if you've been to Ashland, it's predominantly white, and then how it shows you like Mother Nature does not care what race, gender, or who you are, she's gonna come. And I think it was just like a big shocker to see that it hit everyone in those trailer parks. Yeah, well, like Elib was saying earlier, it was the next slide, Elib, was teachers from Phoenix High School and Talent. They organized and made themselves to El Tapatio in Ashland. And that was another center where everyone brought so many waters and clothes. And I think it was to me, it was really beautiful to see how quick everyone was to have each other in solidarity and to support each other. And then after that, we went down to Talent Maker City and we did a mutual aid site there as well. And then we eventually made our way back to Phoenix by the Shops on Exit 24 at the little next to the dollar store. And yeah, it was pretty big support system that everyone had each other.
Yeah, this slide is really great. This was one of the great efforts made right after the fire. This is a restaurant at the north end of Ashland, right near where the fire started. And it was just a family-run restaurant that had a lot of connections in the community, and folks who had to leave Talent drove to the south and parked out in front of this restaurant that had already begun to gather water and supplies for folks. And this family, the the Padilla family really deserves a shout out for the incredible effort that they did. For over a month, they were handing out supplies, handing out meals, and really then had established a bunch of relationships with those folks who had lost their homes, that then the member of the family, Yahaira Padilla, really went above and beyond to stay in touch with these families and really tried to just maintain those relationships. As people are displaced and they're spread out all over the valley, it was really important to make sure that folks knew that the resources were still available. And so trying to maintain those lines of communication was a big part of the effort. And just to give you some context here in Southern Oregon, we had a 1.5% vacancy rate in the county before the fires. And so before the fires, we were already in a housing crisis. And Rogue Action Center had been doing housing justice work for several years and really trying to advocate for low income and affordable housing and accessible housing for many folks who are at the lower end of the income scale. And as you can imagine, this problem has just gotten worse, and we're in a real housing crisis here in Southern Oregon. And Derek is going to speak a little bit later on to just the situation with our houseless neighbors that already existed before the fires and has really been exacerbated by all of this. And so it was organizations and businesses and individuals like El Tapatio that were really able to step in those early days of the fire. And of course, as many of you can probably guess, so far municipalities, the cities, the county government, their ability to step in this way was hampered by all the bureaucracy that they would have to deal with within their realities. And so it's this grassroots network that just became so important in those early days. And really, full disclosure, I didn't actually work for either of these organizations before the fires. I stepped in as a volunteer and have continued in this mutual aid work since then. But it was the connections that Rogue Action Center and Rogue Climate had within the community that in those next days became really important for some of the planning over those first 3 or 4 months of what our relief efforts would look like. And then as the disaster continues, what are the next stages in recovery? And these orgs have really tried to be looking ahead and anticipating where the needs will be in the communities moving forward. And one of the first things that they were able to do was to set up and elevate some of the fundraising efforts that were being made locally. There were a list of individual GoFundMe accounts that Rogue Climate was holding, really trying to elevate those accounts that were underfunded, maybe folks that may not have had access to other resources. And so we were able to create a kind of a link tree with all of these GoFundMe accounts on it so that families could start to receive some direct aid. And several local organizations stepped in and started the Rogue Valley Relief Fund. It was started by a Rogue Action Center, Rogue Climate, Southern Oregon Coalition for Racial Equity, Southern Oregon Rising Tide, and I'm missing somebody.
So healthy.
So healthy, thank you, Derek. Southern Oregon, it's a health equity organization. And those 5 organizations fundraised and were then the steering committee for the dispersal of those funds. And at one point, it was pretty great to see that the entire relief fund, the steering committee, was all women of color at one point, which I think really helped set priorities in the early days of the fire as to where those funds were going, and really recognizing who was most needed in where the need was highest during that time. And so because these organizations and individuals were really unaffiliated, I think is really what has allowed them to be so successful, that they are nimble, that they are able to respond in the moment to the differing needs of the community. As the needs changed from charging my phone and getting some water and finding a place to sleep to what am I going to be eating this next day, and I don't have the clothes I need for work. As these needs evolved, these organizations were really able to adapt and try to organize in different ways to collect supplies, to deliver supplies from one location to another, to recruit volunteers to staff these mutual aid stations, to serve meals. One organization, and I really wish that I'd made them their own slide, but there's a group called Rogue Food Unites, where a couple of business owners or restaurant owners in the area started organizing meals to be cooked from different restaurants all over the valley. And they set themselves up a nonprofit in the very early days of the fire, and have been able to still be providing meals across the community in many locations. And they were able to also hire, or the restaurants that they were providing these meals were being paid for. And so folks were able to get hired back to their jobs who maybe the restaurants had been closed because of COVID. So Rogue Food Unites ended up doing this amazing effort, and they've been able to sustain that throughout this entire year and are going to continue to do that moving forward. And so one of the great skills that that was so useful in the early days was the coordination of those volunteers. And again, we used Signal a lot, and there were different threads that popped up on Signal. There was a driver's thread where people who were able and willing to drive supplies would get a message and folks would step up. There were calls for specific supplies. If we needed water, if we needed diabetic supplies, we could send out those requests through the network, and really through that created this web of support for the community. So that's kind of some context about the beginnings of the fire and kind of what led us into this sustained, prolonged mutual aid effort. What you're looking at here in this slide is one of the two sites that Rogue Climate and Rogue Action Center ran. This was in a parking lot in downtown Talent. And after October, we decided to consolidate all of the mutual aid efforts within the valley into one location so that folks weren't driving to a bunch of places looking for the few resources, but they could come to one central place. And we were trying to be more efficient to save people time driving their cars, and to be able to come just to one spot to find all of the things. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sara, who's going to talk a little bit about the Relief Center. And just so you all know, yesterday was the last day that the Relief Center was open. We ran from September 15th until just yesterday, about 11 and a half months. Our lease expired, and in order to adapt to the needs of the community, we are going to be doing some more mobile mutual aid efforts. So as Sara and I talk about the Relief Center here, it's a little bittersweet. We're still processing the fact that this long effort that we've put forward is ending. It feels like the end of an era. Sara, take it away.
Thanks, Eva. So what was the Fire Relief Center? Pretty much it was a center where people could come in without getting policed, pretty much like asking them if they were impacted by the fire or not. You could have been impacted, a fire survivor, you could have been houseless, you could have been just a family struggling at the moment, and you could still come in and get hot meals, clothes, food, books, house appliances, all that. It was all donated, and we bought a lot of the supplies too with the donations of the GoFundMe's and the Fire Relief Fund. We had a lot of bilingual volunteers and staff. A lot of youth were volunteering and organizing within the site and giving leadership roles where they could take the step up to lead us and find what was and what wasn't working within the resources. We had a little resource center where it was pretty much like a whiteboard or like pretty much a wall of different resources all over the Rogue Valley, from being to food to shelters to different like access numbers and applications. We did a lot of like rent support too as well. We supported all our volunteers with meals that were also ran by the Rogue Food Unites. We advocated for other organizations and agencies when people were having trouble actually applying and using online forms, so they could go to the center and we would help them walk them through the applications. And I would call, or my coworkers would call, and we would advocate on organizations that weren't replying back to the fire survivors or anyone who was just needing support. And yeah, like Elib said, we closed yesterday and it is pretty bittersweet. I don't think it's gonna hit me until we clean up next week. But I'm really excited for the new direction Rogue Climate and Rogue Action Center is gonna take to supporting these families. And I think being remote will be probably a better chance of being able to make sure that people that didn't know we were there or didn't have a way to get to us, we can go to them instead. If you can go into the next slide, Elam. So it's this slide is needs vary by families and individuals. It was no cookie cutter help. People who were less financially resourced before the fires were facing unnecessary denial of loans to rebuild, difficult navigating applications and following through with calls or paperwork. Especially with a lot of our elders, they needed a lot of support. They didn't know how to work their emails or how to work their iPhones, so they came to us for helping them get all that processes, all those paperwork to get processed. Most of the homes that were burned were mobile homes and trailers occupied by the Latinx and farm workers of the community. It was already really hard for them to find a house outside the trailer park. In addition, before the fire, that it became an even bigger barrier for them even after the fire, if you can only imagine. Undocumented members are unable to access a lot of the benefits that came with having health insurance or insurance in general. People were wealthy beforehand with the fire and their lands, and having that land having private insurance, likely more resource networks to rely, less likely to have less resources to rely on, and placed in rental apartments or hotels right away. Um, yeah, FEMA was like what, Elib, like maybe a couple weeks late before actually coming into the Rogue Valley and giving support and building the FEMA parks. Like Phoenix got their first FEMA park not that long ago. And the first one they put was in White City, which I think was pretty ridiculous in a way because it displaced people further out. But and there was a big lack of alerts of where people could go. I think that, I mean, none of us were ready mentally or financially for this fire, but no, but the alert system, like no one knew where to go, and there were roads being blocked off and detours, like everyone was lost and just like freaking out a little bit. But I think with the help of all of our organizations, we had each other's backs. And like I said, Rogue Climbing, Rogue Action Center were on the phones that night, making sure everyone was getting calls and getting checked up on. I'll pass it back
Thank you,
to
Sara. It's kind of like a little microcosm of all the shit that's going down right now out there here in Southern Oregon. We're dealing with climate disaster. We're dealing with COVID disaster now. The numbers are through the roof right now. We've got serious racial justice issues in the way that Latinx communities have had access to resources. And so we're kind of in the middle of all of these compounded factors that are going on in the world right now. And this is a great example of why organizations like ours that are dealing with climate justice might step in to help in disaster. And the intersectionality of all of that is just so apparent in the work that's been done here. Many organizations that stepped in might have stepped in with really good intentions and with some great giant hearts, and a lot of those efforts might not have been what the community actually needed. And so this is a photo of the mountains and piles of clothing that were donated. For any of you who may be organizing mutual aid networks or stations in the future, it would be my suggestion to not accept clothing right from the very beginning, and know that there are resources available in the community who are going to be getting clothing. The Goodwill is going to be flooded. Everywhere is going to be flooded with clothing. Folks imagine that it's super helpful to empty out their closet and take it down to the end of the street to the donation center, but at the time it created just this huge amount of work that needed to be dealt with, and that work could have been better spent in other areas. I think that I'm going to try and get through the rest of these slides so that Ben has and Derek have a good chance to talk, but I think if one lesson was learned throughout all of this, it was just the benefits of organizing around the barriers that exist. We looked to outside regional organizations like the WAC that Ben's going to talk about here. We were really looking at the fact that FEMA, of course, isn't going to help undocumented folks, and how so many folks found themselves in that situation. So how can we step in to provide support for folks who might not be eligible for other benefits? And really just finding all of the shortcuts. Like, what's the shortcut? The city is going to take forever to decide where the pop-up tents are going to go. Let's just go put them in this field over here and we'll figure it out afterwards. Those are the kinds of skills that I think are really important especially in the early parts of relief. Waiting for the established organizations and governments to step in is going to slow down your community's ability to react to the needs of what's going on. One of the things that our organizations did really well was our digital organizing and utilizing our Facebook and Instagram presence to let people know where to go drop off supplies, what supplies were needed, and to recruit volunteers to come in and help us out, really emphasizing this notion of solidarity and not charity. And so in the work that we've done at the relief centers, the volunteers that come in all really are taking on this ethos and really showing up with a desire to be here with their neighbors, and that was elevated from the beginning, really affected the way that the work was done throughout the relief efforts. Leveraging the existing networks and organizing that we had is another one of the big takeaways. Again, those signal groups, the phone banking groups, the lists of volunteers that we had, connecting with local organizations, even those that do not do direct service. So in a community that is a little bit smaller, maybe not a large urban area, what groups have volunteers? Are there church groups out there that have good volunteers? Looking outside of the groups that you maybe would form coalitions with normally, and seeing who's well organized, who has a big list of phone numbers, and tapping into these existing networks was a really big part of the success. One of our most important partners through all of this was Living Waters Church in Medford, which, before the fires, I would not have imagined that they would have stepped up in the way that they did, but they've been able to warehouse a lot of our stuff throughout this whole time. Road Climate had a youth action team that was already organized. They already knew each other. They jumped on the phones to check in with their neighbors throughout the region. It was these kind of grassroots efforts that really made us successful for these efforts here. And one of the connections that we made throughout all of this was with Ben and the Willamette Action Collective. And Ben's going to talk here, but Ben was just incredibly helpful at several different points, calling and asking what we needed, and was able to come down really quickly and step in. And so as you all find yourselves in similar situations, we hope that you would reach out to the RAC, to Rogue Climate, to some of these existing networks that have been doing this work. And so I'm going to turn it over here to Ben.
Awesome. Thank you, Sada. Thank you, Elib. I appreciate all that and all that we learned. Elib, if it works, I'll probably just say like next slide whenever I want you to advance the slide. Cool. So yeah, like was said, I'm a member of the Willamette Action Collective. I'm just going to drop our website in here. I'm going to talk a little bit about us generally, but only insofar as how that motivates us to show up in forms of like regional solidarity, because I think that's really important into understanding like why we're doing the work that we're doing. And then ultimately I'll start talking about how we engaged in 2020 fire relief, and then specifically how we engaged in Southern Oregon around the Almeida Fire. But my hope today is that these will be some useful pieces of information for all of us who are organizing on the West Coast. And you know, with that, please ask questions, you know, engage, you know, let me know how whatever information I might have might be useful for all of us to collectively move forward. So if I could get the next slide, please. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that WAC is a political organization, and we released a statement on September 10th last year. So in the middle of the fire season, kind of like providing our analysis of the fire. And I wanted to include it just because it like shows where we're coming from. And then also I think characterizes what it felt like to be in the middle of Oregon in that first few weeks of September last year. So I'm just gonna read this really quick. Nearly 1 million acres of Oregon have burned in the last 3 days, double the state's annual average of acres lost to wildfires. While WAC organizes to supply emergency aid to those who have fled or lost their homes, we emphasize that this catastrophe is evidence of our societal failure to protect our natural environment. Since the late 1980s, the reality of radical global climate change has been consistently downplayed or entirely denied by the US government. These enormous fires are the inevitable outcome of a pervasive economic structure that peddles lies to enable corporate profiteering at the expense of the planet's ecological integrity. Indigenous peoples have lived across North America since time immemorial, and these unprecedented fires are further proof that restoring land to Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship is imperative for all of our survival. We must dismantle the capitalist system that knowingly spent decades creating the conditions killing us today. We must stand in solidarity with people as our climate crisis worsens. We must create a system that values the health of humanity and the global ecology. And so I just wanted to include that for the reasons that I listed. And I also just think that it's helped me personally to frame this work that we're doing going forward, to kind of understand like, why is it that we've let climate collapse get to such an extent that we're having these massive fires that consume us for months, if not all of a season here on the West Coast. So I'll just drop WAC's website. Oh, I already did that. Again, next slide, please. And so then to get into what we did during the 2020 season, I think one of y'all said earlier that there's kind of this like necessity to kind of be infinitely adaptable, because it's like everyone's needs are going to be different and everybody's communities are different. And so as we've done work around emergency relief, be it for water or in this conversation fire, you know, we emphasize that there's this need to be infinitely adaptable. So, you know, kind of a totally different model than what like Red Cross or FEMA takes, in that, you know, we are listening to the communities who have been affected by whatever crisis is going on and responding in the ways that those communities are asking for us to show up, and not coming with this kind of top-down model of supplying whatever sort of relief is needed. So to exemplify that, you know, we have chapters in Salem, Portland, and Eugene, and we'd be happy to extend throughout Oregon if anyone wants to connect with us. But like, for example, there was another fire in Oregon last year. It was the Holiday Farm fire that devastated, almost burned down entirely the town of Blue River, Oregon. And so similar to what was described by Sara and Elib, in Southern Oregon, we ran an aid site in Eugene, Oregon, where climate refugees who were leaving Blue River could stop, you know, and get whatever they needed. You know, we got, you know, everything from gas money for people who were fleeing to try to find the loved ones' homes, to food, to KN95 masks, to respirators, to menstrual supplies, to toothbrush, toothpastes. Yeah, shout out to Patrick who was one of the people running that aid site in Eugene, Oregon. Yeah, totally agree with Elib. There's no need to ask for clothes. I think we actually had a wedding dress donated to us, you know, which speaks to just people trying to clean out their closets. So that's like, you know, we have the capacity to respond with an aid site, but then we saw like a different need in Salem, Oregon, where we had been working for a long time with a Latinx family organization, is what I think they call themselves, Mano a Mano, that does a lot of work with farm workers, undocumented peoples and their families. And so one of the things that was happening during the fires of last year is we had this unbreathable 500 level air quality index. And farm workers were being forced to work in the Salem-Keizer area in unbreathable conditions. And so also really want to give a big shout out to Redwoods and Mask Oakland, who helped us get 2,000 KN95 masks really quickly to try to get to the farm working community. And at that same time, Mano a Mano asked us, like, is there a way for us to put pressure into, on the fact that this is happening? Can we uplift just the narrative that there's these farm workers getting forced to work in these horrible conditions? And so I think it was a thing that, you know, the farm workers themselves and Mano a Mano asked us to do. So we put together this kind of series of pressure campaigns to try to make it so it would be illegal in such unbreathable conditions to force people to work outside, which is like, no shit. But obviously, you know, our system's not set up to protect the worker. And so successfully, Mano a Mano and the farm workers were able to campaign to get Kate Brown to say, no, it's illegal for y'all to do that. I'll talk about what we did with Southern Oregon here in a second. And going into kind of like the next point of my slide, next slide, is connecting Portland mutual aid organizations that had popped up during the Black Lives Matter uprisings to rural communities. So during the uprisings of last summer, there was all these mutual aid organizations that popped up that were supplying aid to people who were protesting during the uprisings. And then suddenly there's this fire, you know, no one could go outside because it was unbreathable. And so there's all these mutual aid organizations that were trying to be like, hey, like, how do we now transition to this next the next thing that's happening, you know, like how do we have this infrastructure of mutual aid, how do we apply that to what is an obvious need now? And so one of the things that is a testament to that I think is really important for us to know as we do mutual aid organizing in emergencies is that metropolitan areas stockpile resources. And so by the nature of living in an industrialized society, we who live in Portland, Oregon, you know, I'm part of Portland WAC, we have more access to KN95s, to waters, to well, respirators, to all the things that, you know, that you need when you lose everything, you know, like that stuff is stockpiled in metropolitan areas. And so we ended up running supplies out of Eugene and out of Portland and out of Salem to rural communities across the state, trying to get people the supplies that they need, that if you live in a small town like Blue River, Oregon, which is a tiny, tiny little town outside of Eugene, doesn't necessarily have the same stockpiled resources to respond to an emergency like this. Can I get the next slide, please? And so one of the things that I want to talk about in connecting to communities during an emergency, it's like, I think a thing that can be done really poorly, even when you have the best of intentions. And so I wanted to include in our conversation today, before I start talking about Southern Oregon specifically, kind of like my personal advice is like what you would do if you are a mutual aid organization, or even if you're just an individual with a strong community, or whether you're a part of a church, or whether you're a part of, you know, a D&D group or something like that as a community, and you can use that community to plug into an emergency situation that another community is experiencing. But what does that look like, and my advice into how to do that well? And so the first thing I put on here is like, be realistic about what you can provide. When people are experiencing an emergency situation and you contact them, maybe you have a pre-existing connection within the community, maybe you just get connected over social media, maybe you get someone's phone number. It can be tempting to be like, hey, I'm here to help. And someone who's experiencing an emergency situation might have such a drastic need that they think your offered help might meet their need. And I think that can be really dangerous. And so trying to be early on and being like, this is the capacity that our organization has. This is who we are. This is where we're coming to this from. So then you're not creating a false expectation. And one of the tools to do that I always advocate for is get a list of needs put in an order of priority. So instead of just being said, okay, hey, we've lost these people, the community has lost their houses, people need everything. Well, you as a community or an organization can't provide everything. But if you ask someone who's organizing on the ground and is a part of the community, hey, what do you need most? That might be a thing that a local organizer can hold on to and go, oh, you know what we really need right now is we need tents because people who've been displaced by their fires have nowhere to go. And you go, okay, cool. I'm going to take my community that I'm trying to show up with in solidarity and get tents because that's what you've asked for. The other thing within that I would recommend is find out how many people are in need of that. You know, so if you get this huge list of needs, instead of trying to meet all those things that have been listed for you, you know, if you find out, okay, there's 5,000 or 500 people that got displaced, and then you can go, okay, I can grab onto that number, and I, in as quick a period as possible, am going to try to get 500 tents instead of getting 20 tents and 100 toothbrushes and, you know, 30 gallons of water. You know, listen to the local organizer, find out what the top priority is, and go, okay, I or our organization have the capacity to do that. So that's another recommendation. Go back to your organization, make a plan. You know, this is functional. It means how are you getting there? How fast can you get there? Who's going to drive? When will you arrive? Figure all that out within your community or your organization. Then communicate that plan back to who you're giving the aid to or in solidarity with. You know, this is what we're going to do. We're going to show up on this day with this amount of stuff, and you can expect me there in between noon and 2. That gives another opportunity for the community that's been impacted to go, hey, things kind of changed a little bit, or yes, that sounds great, but you as someone showing up in solidarity, you know, have a responsibility to like check yourself if that no longer meets the need of the community. Move fast, move smart. You know, this is an emergency, you know, like the difference between you getting people water today and tomorrow can literally be a life or death thing. You know, lung damage if you can get masks a week or today instead of a week later, you know, but also move intelligently, don't put yourself at risk. There were some mutual aid organizations coming out of Portland that were driving into dangerous situations and not really knowing what they were getting into. So it's important you really look at it realistically. And then ultimately what I'll talk about at the end here is like make a plan for the future. You know, solidarity means that we're showing up for each other indefinitely as a community, recognizing that your needs are my needs, and that as we struggle, we all struggle, and so trying to lift each other up collectively. So, you know, don't overpromise, make a plan for the future. And now I want to transition into like what that looked like regarding the Almeida Fire. So we had been running aid supplies to Salem and running the mutual aid hub out of Eugene, and then, you know, I think it was like September 10th, September 11th, where we stopped seeing so many people coming through our mutual aid site in Eugene, but we had these resources that we got, and we had a certain amount of attention at that moment, just via social media, and because we were an organization that was running supplies out of Portland. So there was all these Portland mutual aid organizations that saw that WAC was connected to rural organizing, so we started putting out these asks, being like, hey, we know that there's other people experiencing fire around Oregon. Let us know what we can do. And so then it was on September 12th, a local organizer, thank you. A local organizer contacted us, I think via Instagram, Teresa Cisneros, who I think is organized with some of y'all in Southern Oregon, contacted us and said like, hey, I'm in this situation where I am in communication with these families that have, you know, experienced their house is burning down with the Almeida Fire, and they're in a fairgrounds here in Southern Oregon without tents, some without masks. And I saw your organization's post on Instagram. So I talked to Teresa, you know, I'm up in Portland, talked to Teresa, kind of did what I explained just previously, got a list of needs, talked to WAC comrades who are in Eugene and Salem and said, hey, these are the needs that got requested. Can we match that ask? We agreed that yes, we could. And then was it just the next? Yeah, it was the next day. I drove down through Salem, got whatever I could from Salem, met WAC Eugene comrades, and the bus that y'all can see in that photo is WAC member Moose's tour bus. You know, and so it speaks that in these emergency situations, you kind of just grab whatever resources you can. And we loaded up this full school bus with as many supplies as we could, responding to the explicit asks that Teresa was putting out there. You know, the four of us from WAC were just huddled at the top of the bus, drove through the fires, got down to Southern Oregon, and helped Teresa unload all this with her team that she had down there. And then I think the next days it went out to the family. And I want to just emphasize something that Alib said over and over again, which is like, we were able to do this because WAC had a pre-existing organizing structure. And so because we were in conversation with people in Salem and Eugene, we were able to respond like the next day because we had this pre-existing organizing structure that when Teresa contacted us, we go, cool, we have this structure, we can take advantage of it, and we'll show up tomorrow. But then importantly, you know, when subsequent deliveries to Southern Oregon, importantly to note that like as the smoke clears, you know, an emergency will lose a lot of attention, but really showing up in solidarity means that you're like checking in, you know, regularly, that you're recognizing that community's needs as a part of your community and showing up for them as you would for your community, because they are your community. And so one of the things that happened just via regional solidarity, I got in contact, I think with Elib, that's when you and I met. And there was this, I said like, hey, like, what do you all need? We know that this, you know, emergency that continues despite the fact that the fire might be out. What does that look like? And there was this ask around stoves, fuel, camp stoves, because people were experiencing kind of indefinite houselessness. And so it's like, how do we show up for that? You know, there's this huge need, but this was a way that WAC could plug in, that we recognize that specifically stoves, fuel, that was a thing we could do realistically. You know, we weren't trying to meet the entire need, but that was a thing that we could do. So we put out this ask within our community. Just because the smoke is now gone does not mean the emergency is over. WAC is coordinating with the Phoenix Fire Relief Site to distribute camping stoves to these families. While our government has failed to truly help these families recover from the disaster, our community has the ability to support itself. Please help us by donating or offering our organization discounts for, and then the ask that was supplied within a short period of time, you know, like a week or so, we were able to get those supplies down, to Southern Oregon. And then have a conversation, because that's what solidarity is all about, with Teresa and Elib being like, what does this look like going forward? And so then if you move into my last slide here, recognizing that like in an emergency happens, like the Almeida Fire, like what happened to Blue River, you know, like what could happen with an earthquake, or what could happen with any myriad emergency, you know, as the public attention leaves, the communities impacted by that emergency are going to continue to have needs in the long term. And so then I kind of put together these checkpoints here about what does that look like, or what is my opinion of what that looks like. So check in, you know, remind community organizers that your support is still available. You know, that just because you haven't talked in a week doesn't mean that you're not, or a month or 2 months does not mean you're not receptive to getting a random phone call and being like, you know, shit, I'm in this situation where we need a bunch of blank now. Can your organization help? You know, you can do a check-in to take that onus off the people experiencing the worst of the emergency. Figure out what supplies would maybe help address those needs that people are expressing. Maybe it's advocacy, like I mentioned. Is there an awareness campaign that then applies political pressure, or can accrue material needs? You know, I think those two GoFundMes that were mentioned earlier, WAC and our work with the Oregon Coalition for Land and People's Rights, we like propped those GoFundMes because we heard from local organizers like, this is what would be useful. Continue to connect. So maybe your organization is no longer the best organization to connect with the people who are on the ground, and that's okay for your org to step back and facilitate a conversation between other people. Maybe that connection is what's going to do the most good going forward. And you know, that's just a moment where you got to recognize that you're not a hero. You're not, you know, this is not your thing. What are the needs of the the community who experienced the emergency situation? And then I think, you know, we can do what we're doing now, which is prepare. We can be in these conversations, we can educate each other, we can prepare for the inevitable, more frequent emergencies as climate collapse continues. You know, we can be proactive instead of always reactive. And then the last thing I put on there, just because it's WAC's perspective, is that we can revolt. You know, that we recognize that this capitalist structure profits off of disasters. You know, you can just Google search and read about disaster capitalism. You know, it's myriad companies make millions of dollars off disasters every year. And we in WAC recognize that, you know, we can create a better community that doesn't allow for the profiting of companies during an emergency, and that will ultimately be more resilient for nature and for us as a global humanity. So thank you all for listening. And then I'm just gonna, I think, pass it to Derek, or maybe back to folks at the RAC. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. And I love that we've ended on this slide, because there's a couple ways that the work has really evolved for us as well here at Rogue Action Center and at Rogue Climate. After doing the mutual aid work, the conversations within the community started happening about what was the rebuild going to be looking like? What support did our communities need as we tried to put this all together? And so being able to get involved in some of these local conversations, to call out disaster capitalism by name in a meeting of county commissioners, to sit at the table and say, no, we don't need single family homes to be rebuilt where these trailer parks were. We need to make sure that multi-generational homes that are culturally sensitive to the communities that were displaced be what is being rebuilt. And so a lot of the work that the RAC and that Rogue Climate are doing now moving forward is trying to advocate within these more formal spaces with some of this revolutionary ideas that we can make our communities better through this work. And a disaster has a great way of showing us the way that shit is broken. And here is an opportunity to do to fix some of that. And so we've been successful as much as I could have hoped in those conversations. There is a housing co-op and a community land trust that is purchased one of the trailer parks that is going to be building here real soon. So that's a real exciting product of some of the activism that has happened here. And as you can imagine, with the fires and so many folks being displaced and the housing crisis that we were experiencing beforehand, one of the consequences of this fire has been a real increase in the houseless population here in Southern Oregon. So I invited Derek to talk to us about the work that he's been doing in Medford.
Hey all, my name is Derek. My pronouns are he, him. I organize with Siskiyou Rising Tide, as well as Judy's Midnight Diner. Yeah, I really appreciate hearing everything everybody's sharing, and it's nice to be able to contribute a little bit. So during the fires here in Jackson County, which I think it's important to name, there's the Almeida Fire. There was also the Obichain Fire, which was in a bit more rural Jackson County, as well as the Slater Fire in Josephine County. So there were evacuations and displacements and homes being burned in this region of Southern Oregon through all of those. And I think sometimes we forget some of the rural communities, and I think it's just important to name them among the fires that were happening all throughout the West Coast. But the Almeida Fire specifically moved along, as Elib was mentioning, a section of our towns called the Bear Creek Greenway, which is where unhoused folks where a lot of unhoused folks live. It's also where unhoused folks were told, and you could even say forced, to shelter in place during the pandemic. And so the fire, it's a greenway stretch along Bear Creek, which is part of the Rogue River watershed, and that connects all of our towns. It runs along I-5, and this is also one of the main routes that the fire took to then started in North Ashland, spread into Talent and Phoenix. So unhoused folks living along the Greenway, like everyone else living along Talent and Phoenix and North Ashland, had to evacuate. Many folks lost their homes. As I think Sada was saying, there was no county alert system, right? So it was people going out there and communicating to one another what was going on. And in addition to all of the really amazing mutual aid spaces and hubs, like people going to El Tapatio and Home Depot and all of these spaces, Hawthorne Park was a place in Medford where a lot of folks were congregating and staying, and there was resources appearing there, just sort of like this amazing outpouring of generosity from the community. Hawthorne Park is for a long time has been a community hub for unhoused folks, especially in the Medford area. During the uprising, it also became a really important place for mutual aid from Black-led community groups, and so it also became this space for Really, I think it was the same sort of what we call mutual aid disaster relief that was happening all over the county, and all, you know, that was happening in Grants Pass, that happens everywhere in the wake of fires. But I think because of the and it wasn't just previously unhoused folks that were staying there, but I think because of the perceived demographics, both of who was living there as well as who was, you know, running it, folks that believe that Black Lives Matter, folks that, you know, aren't in favor of fascism, things like that. The perception of these two things led to an increased criminalization. And so unlike, while many of the mutual aid hubs in Jackson County were celebrated, the Hawthorne Park, after providing really incredible and remarkable community space for evacuees and folks, was then raided by the police. About a dozen police officers or police vehicles came and raided what was a humanitarian aid camp. And we've seen, you know, I think it's important to say this too. I think that mutual aid, you know, like Benjamin was talking to this a bit, I think mutual aid is inherently political. You know, in my understanding, it's a tactic used by social movements to fight against white supremacy and capitalism and settler colonialism and these empires that we live under. And in as such too, when you're, you know, mutual aid, often what we saw in Hawthorne Park was a really intense politicization of community coming together and looking out for one another. We've also seen this continue to play out in Medford. So after the last winter, Medford proposed a new ordinance that's citywide that makes it 30 days in jail and a $500 fine simply for living in a tent, and written into as well as closing the Greenway during fire season for increased criminalization. And one of the written into the ordinance itself is this fear of fires. So, you know, the Almeida Fire started in Ashland. It was not started by folks living on the Greenway in Medford, you know, but we see directly written into the ordinance this fear and these fire politics, and blaming and scapegoating unhoused individuals. Also written into the ordinance originally, although this was taken out in part of the campaign fight against the ordinance, but it was also written in there around people organizing or operating encampments, which I think was about targeting alleged activists, or whatever you call someone who supports community-led initiatives. And so I think and unfortunately, this is not a new story. You know, it's really interesting in the wake of the fires to see. I think mutual aid should inherently question who deserves support and who doesn't. You know, if someone was living on the Greenway, did they not deserve support? If someone had a tent in a house that burned down and are denied FEMA access, right? They were allowed to stay by whoever owned that property or rented that property, but they get no FEMA because they don't have an address. As well as, like, why don't we just feed, like, why don't people have access to food all the time? Do you have to, you know? So these questions I think we should be asking ourselves, and in the waves of what comes after a disaster, I think the first couple weeks here it's an incredible time to be in this area, to see the generosity of folks coming together. And then as the weeks go by, we see these more, you know, stipulations come, and we see as Red Cross and FEMA pull out, we see like this policing of who's worthy of support and what that looks like. And I think that it's really important that we fight against that we resist that. I think one of our efforts, we received a couple one-time grants in some of the work that we're doing, but we've also chosen not to be reliant on grant funding or federal government funding, to be very wary of even, you know, like, there are incredible nonprofits here that we love to throw down with and support, but also to be wary even of that level of responding to disaster, and therefore not linking, you know, it's not like, oh, here's our chance to link politics with disaster. It's like these things are inherently political. Watching friends have their homes destroyed, and then the failure of the government to respond to this. And I think it's really important that we are free enough in our mutual aid organizing to link this to the struggles that it is linked to, that we're willing, as whatever we're thinking of ourselves, community members involved in mutual aid, to be also, in our case of working with unhoused folks, fighting with and for our unhoused friends against the increased criminalization and policing, which I'm sad to say this is now spreading across the West Coast. Like, I'm hearing from friends in Portland that Portland is also now particularly policing unhoused folks under this guise of fire safety. And our friends in Portland are saying, yeah, they're watching what's going on in Medford, and they're borrowing this ordinance, and the way that our governments are using disasters as a way to further empire, and I think we see similar stories in Chico. We see like Aaron Goodling is a researcher with Western Regional Advocacy Project who's focusing on some of these things. And I think I don't know what else to say other than it's been really incredible to be in relationship with folks like Rogue Climate and the Rogue Action Center, and all the many, hundreds and hundreds of people who, may or may not have names that will be remembered or not, but that really have come together and been willing to question these boundaries and been willing to fight together for the world we would like to see, and amidst what is really a pretty apocalyptic reality that we're living in these days, but coming together amidst that is really incredible to be a part of. So thank you for having me included in this, and the work everyone here is doing and building in their own communities is really inspiring. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I realize this took a whole lot longer than we thought it was going to. And so I do have some time and can stay for questions and answers. So
That's okay. I know Mask Oakland also wanted to present a bit about
great.
their work. Do those folks want to go? I am mindful of time. I'm sorry this has gone so long, but if possible, let's kind of keep it pretty concise.
If we know anything about fires, we know that it's always bigger and more complicated than we thought it would be. So, hey, I'm Edwards. Mask Oakland started in October 2017 during what's called, now referred to as like the NorCal complex fires in Napa and Sonoma. It was several series of fires, many of which were traced back to being started by the equipment of Pacific Gas and Electric, which is like the corporate utility privatized that has like pushed further to like towards deregulation and privatization. So just, deeply resonating with a lot of the themes here. And first of all, I just want to say thanks for having us, and Jimmy for reaching out again. We kind of got big on the map in 2018, and a lot of people reached out to us. And I think probably everyone who's done this kind of work has felt some moment in which like all the things are in your hand and you can make things happen and make things move, and then it bottoms out at some point and you feel just like burnt out and unable to follow up and unable to connect any dots when everything seems so clear and lucid before. And I just want to say, thanks everybody for continuing to come back to the collective work and the individual relationships, because it's really important, and it's super awesome to be in the room with some people, both new volunteers who've attended trainings for my organization that I haven't actually been in a meeting with yet, and then folks who I maybe just talked to because I saw a really high AQI on the map, and I saw that we had a lot of masks, and I just like made the connection really fast. But to hear like the larger story and context is really cool. So just to reciprocate a little bit, in 2017, I was a trans disabled queer person on a speaking tour talking about being trans and complex post-traumatic stress. And I came home from a speaking tour and actually thought about like moving out of the Bay Area because of housing struggles here. And then suddenly there was just kind of this shutdown of let's stay inside, and there's all this smoke from these fires. Everybody stay inside. Everybody stay inside and, you know, wear a mask, but nobody can get masks. Like that was just the kind of in my white transplant disabled queer subculture narrative, whatever, of what the thing was. Stay inside, there are no masks. And at one point someone posted on Facebook and said, hey, there's some masks. A Black poet friend of mine in West Oakland, and I went to get the masks and I saw a food distribution line in Oakland, and I saw that people were standing outside in that line. Nobody had masks on. I drove past a couple of tent encampments under bridges. No one had masks, and it just created a lot of cognitive dissonance for me. It felt like seeing a bunch of like people driving without doors on their cars or something, like very just alarming. I did have like a background in environmental justice, so I guess maybe some awareness of like stuff in the air can really hurt you, and maybe some of the language like PM 2.5 and stuff like that resonated with me from a policy standpoint. But also I was just out there and I quickly Googled like where has masks, found that one place maybe did, called them, they did. I went and I bought $300 of masks and I created a Twitter account at Mask Oakland, took a picture of the receipt, posted it. Then I went, speaking of so I think that my story is interesting because I had some like Occupy and other grassroots organizing background, but I didn't really like have an organization or a network. I did have like a community. It's a problematic, disparate, queer, trans, disabled, and or not communities. But I actually went on a Facebook group and said, so our own social media was not that significant for us in our first year. I think a lot of groups are like, oh, how can I get big? Like Mask Oakland, like, so we have 2,000-3,000 followers on things and we can raise $100,000 online in like a couple weeks. Our first year, nobody knew what the hell we were doing. They're like, why are you here? There's a fire, like office workers, everybody like, the sky's blue. And so we would have to like get out the app, point to them like, here's this app. The fire can actually come from here, from far away, 90 miles away, and it can come here and it can hurt you. And it'll actually hurt you before you feel it. And we're really concerned about these tiny particles that are so small that they go into your lungs can't filter them. They go into your bloodstream can't filter them, and then they go into your brain and your heart and they mess you up permanently. And it's really hard talking about PM 2.5 sometimes, or tiny particles, because it's not going to kill a lot of people immediately, but it's going to cause permanent long-term harm and increase hospitalizations. And now there's studies out saying that it's probably 10 times more dangerous than like urban pollution, because so much crap is burning, right? Buildings, you got lead, all kinds of stuff that you're breathing in, not just like, it's not just a campfire, right? So, and then there's the studies talking about like making COVID worse, and probably all of that isn't significant enough. So anyway, back in that early time, it was like, we would just walk around and try to sell people masks on the street and say, hey, if you give us money for these masks, like 3 or 4 times what we paid for it, we'll take that and we'll then go buy masks and distribute those in encampments. And it was very hard. We were like sneaking into office buildings in downtown Oakland and like trying to explain what was going on. And some people were like, yeah, I've been looking for masks. Totally, take $20, take $5. It was nice. I got a couple small articles written about us. And then we hoped it would never happen again after distributing about 4,000 masks, locally to encampments and things like that. And then we sent, I think, like a few hundred up into Napa, where people were still struggling. And I felt like, okay, I did that. Probably never got back that $300, but like did cool stuff. Even in the beginning, there was all this tension. There was people being like, we have to say F Libby Schaaf, like the mayor, like we have to go after how like this is a proof of everything is messed up. And it was messed up. We were calling like all these offices, the air quality office, the air emergency office, like the blah, blah, blah. And they're like, what? And one of my colleagues was actually in a meeting with those people, and they're like, let's step outside because, you know, we want to have this meeting outside. And then they were like coughing during the meeting, and then people were coming and reaching over my colleague and like grabbing masks from them, like as these government officials were saying like, oh, we're not sure if we can do masks. So it was very bizarre. And then in 2018, we got a couple Facebook messages. Yeah, thank you. We got a couple of Facebook messages that said like, hey, smoke's coming in from this thing they're calling the campfire in Paradise. Do you guys still exist? And it was like, I guess we still exist. So went out, bought a few masks from the same shop, posted on Twitter, posted a couple local news stories, went to bed, woke up to $15,000 in my Venmo. And I was like, okay. And then like 2 days later, Teen Vogue wrote a story about us. It said, #1 way to help California right now, Red Cross. #2, Mask Oakland. And it started to get pretty weird. And I think that was like this whole era. But people were coming to my house. We had like 100,000 masks eventually. People were coming to my house saying like, I have to protect my children. Give me masks. And, you know, people were like, Redwoods, you need to eat. And it had that like whole big wild collective vibe. People were like figuring out mapping and setting up training centers, and it felt really special. We went and like protested at a PG&E hearing, and it was also like 20-hour days, and we were getting like, then it's like Guardian, Chronicle, blah blah blah, and it felt like, oh wow, you know. And it also felt really like, for my trans work, I was posted on this hate site Kiwi Farms like around the same time, which is like a doxing hit list for like trans activists and other people. And so I got really like paranoid, and then like some groups started critiquing us, and then like I was like, oh God, you know, like it's all part of the, like, it was really heady and strange to go from like 0 to hero to like 0 to negative. I don't know. You know, like we had like 2.4 million impressions on Twitter that first time, and we were reaching all these camps and had this huge heat map, and it was very exciting. Hundreds of volunteers. And then like it dropped off 95% in December and January that following year. And it was just me and a couple burnt out other people. And nothing really happened in 2019. Then 2020, you know, was the year of the mask. And we didn't quite like seize the day, but we got involved. We gave the masks that we had to emergency rooms pretty fast. Speed is the name of the game in that first week. In those first weeks, it was often like the government was like, well, we're going to have it's the weekend, so we're going to have a procurement specialist look at that on Monday and, you know, get back to you about an estimate about the thing. And then they were like, oh, also we have 100,000 expired masks from SARS. You know, do you want those? It was bizarre. And then like getting dunked on by like politicians being like, we partnered with Mask Oakland, but really they just like sent a DM in Twitter saying thanks or something. Like, it was super bizarre. And then in 2020, we'd do it all over again, but we couldn't go to each other's houses. Around mid-August, there were 10,000 lightning strikes in a 24-hour period with no rain. And it caused like the hundreds of fires, which also ultimately became the lightning complex fires, and you know, millions of acres, et cetera, et cetera. We did about 100,000 masks again. but instead of buying some of them, we got some of them donated in kind, which was like a mixed bag, and then did some buying. And anyway, that was like 3 weeks before you guys. So that's why I was able to be in the mode, in the zone, and be like, oh, okay, Medford, Ashland, who are these organizations, like what's going on? Because we were kind of like not cooling off, but had our systems in place. If it happened now, honestly, like, I don't know that we'd be able to help you, because like San Francisco donors don't feel personally affected by it right now. And so they're not necessarily giving money right now. But we've been able to mobilize like dozens of people, each time. And I'd say just the last thing I want to close is that the expertise of like being marginalized people, were multiracial, multi-gender, multi-ability collective, I think also can lead to a lot of imposter syndrome. Like, oh, there's no organization like us. There's no leadership like me. There's no whatever. And so I think that when you've had success before, you can feel pressure to recreate that success in the exact same form again, because that's what the media liked, and that's what raised that money that one time, and that's what. And I think connecting to your core values and adapting to actually getting the work done, and trusting that it's not actually like, even though there are those moments where you flash bang and get some big success or whatever, that ultimately is not this transformative change that we're looking for. And so like, instead of just being a media puppet flash in the pan, like government subsidy of the government, like trying to be transformative takes like that ongoing relationship building. So it's a mess, but it is a mess, and glad to be here in it with you all. And thanks for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Redwoods. I'm so sorry I had to keep being like, oh, just because we kind of went a bit long. And thank you to all of our awesome presenters. That was a lot of information, but I think those stories of like how this actually goes down are so crucial. So far I have 3 questions from the chat that people have posted so far. I'm going to start off with those. Maybe I'll just have folks keep posting your questions in the chat and I'll just call them out. It's 7:40. I'm going to try and wrap this up before 8. We were originally thinking till 7:30, but we had a lot to cover. So first, just a kind of procedural one was to those folks with the slideshow asking, can we share it out with probably the Signal thread? Yes, cool. Second one was for RAC, was how large did the relief fund get?
I think when it was its largest, it was $900,000. I think that some of that was spent down and then it's been refunded. I think it's sitting around $400,000 right now. A large chunk of that money, $300,000 of it, is going towards that cooperative land trust trailer park that's happening. So a large chunk of it's going there. The company that was holding it, the MSR Foundation, is no longer holding that money. It needs to be transferred to another spot. So there's this kind of holdup in the access that some folks are having to that right now. But it was a huge effort, and it was shared across a bunch of different agencies, and it was really an effective way to get money and stuff to people in a really quickly.
Thank you. Next one was also for RAC. What supplies were needed but hard to get or hard to get enough of immediately after the fire or in the longer term? Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for all your help.
Hey, y'all. Yeah, it's really nice learning from all y'all, and feel free to reach out to WAC just via our website or Twitter or whatever. We're here to help. Bye, y'all.
Because we are kind of removed from supply chain, there were things like just the process of getting a pallet of water from Costco to the relief site, or that Costco was only letting people purchase 1 pallet of water at a time, were some of the things that were really hampering to us. And so in those early days, especially, I would say water, like as much as you can possibly move was the big resource. Another surprising requests that we had were for diapers, and not just diapers, but diapers of various sizes. And so because that was such a huge need, so many of the families affected had young kids at home, we got to the point where we knew who had size 5 diapers in the valley, who had size 3s. And so that was one of the needs. Some of those emergency medical supplies for folks who were diabetic, for folks who needed oxygen. These were some of the things that really were big barriers and challenges early on. And then as far as the dailies, we got a lot of donations of, you know, food and toiletries and clothing, even though we didn't want it. And so the real basics came in, and that's really what we tried to focus on. Masks were challenging for a while to get a hold of, but then eventually many organizations showed up with those. So those were some of the hurdles that we had early on.
Thanks so much. Do we have any other questions for water? Would filters have helped, or did you just need already bottled?
Yeah, there was some work that went into like creating some water fill stations that we've looked at. But as far as getting stuff to people quickly, it was the bottled water that was really helpful right up front. And then as we continued to serve families, a lot of whom were living in hotels, the FEMA congregate housing was to put people in hotels. You know, who wants to drink hotel water for a year long, right? And so that need has been continuing. And so these water fill stations with water filters is something that we're looking at. And even though the site is closing, we're trying to figure out how and where to make those available for folks who still don't have stable water. And then, yeah, I see the question in the chat. Do folks just want cash? Absolutely. And gift cards were something that we started to hand out really regularly, especially in the first weeks and months after the fire. But then cash became a real challenge for us in how to distribute it across the community, because what we found happen would be that the same folks would end up showing up and know that we were offering these resources. And we know that the need was there. We know that it's absolutely vital. And yet we were having trouble making sure that those gift cards were being made available to everyone. And we had folks who would then drive all the way down to the relief site for a $25 gas card that we no longer had because we'd given them all away. And so to get cash via gift cards to people was a real challenge, and something that we actually needed to step back from about the turn of the year and decide that we were no longer going to be making those available to everybody. And what we did with those cards that were donated was then to really, as people were coming to us with specific needs, say, oh, here's $100 at Target, you know, go buy that canopy that you need to set up next to your RV or whatever it was. But distributing cash is, and I've heard from other communities, from North Bay folks and from Paradise folks, that it was a real challenge for them as well.
With limited funds, how do you maximize the assistance? I can ask a question.
I don't know. I think, you know, the way we've done everything is by people showing up in solidarity, really, like bottom line, like, how do we get stuff done? Well, this week we need to close down the talent site. So let's all put the stuff in the back of a truck, and it happens. And so I think that the reality is we live in a world of abundance, right? We are surrounded by all the shit we could possibly want and all the resources we could possibly want. So how do we organize in this abundance to try and get that to the folks in need? And I think, like, ultimately that's the skills and the tools that we're all trying to develop here as we tear this shit down and build something new, right?
I have sort of, I guess it's not so much a question as like a comment that I've noticed, and especially out of what y'all were talking about, that is like a synthesis, is this right? that what I've seen with fire relief, especially in this area, because I've only done really COVID relief in this area, that right off the bat, the kind of FEMA Red Cross types are gonna cover the middle class and more wealthy folks. And that it's really, you know, undocumented folks, tribal nations, and just like other very low income folks who have a lot of need right up front. And to me, that's sort of where like our kinds of groups fit in. And then the other thing that it seems like we have kind of a strategic advantage on doing is like long-term relief once, you know, the FEMA camps go away. And things like helping people fill out forms. That was something that I hadn't really thought of that was so important to learn. So I thought I'd
Yeah, that's actually, and Sada, do you want to speak to that? That's Sada's position here moving forward in our relief, is being that resource navigator. You want to talk just briefly, Sada, about that?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Oh, we were just talking about resources and helping people fill out forms and how important and vital that has been. So I don't know if you want to share a bit.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Within being resource navigator, I think it was all, I didn't really understand my title until I really got into it and was having an experience on making like the language of those applications digestible for the community members. I think that was the biggest barrier, especially for families that were undocumented. They didn't if you opened up certain applications and you would read the first couple sentences and they couldn't understand it, they just assumed that that wasn't their type of benefit they could get. And then with coming to the Fire Relief Center and being able to have someone bilingual like me, my coworker Perla or Lucas, where it would be like, no, this is actually extremely for you in your situation. Let me translate it, break it down, and make it into a language that you understand what's happening and what you're gonna get from this. Then, if they just did it on their own, and I think that's like the biggest issue that I still see to this day with being as a resource navigator, is that there's a lot of applications that, first of all, aren't bilingual and aren't translated not in just Spanish but in many other languages, but also that the language they do use isn't digestible enough for family members, aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas to like understand that that's for them. But I'm really grateful that Rogue Climate and Rogue Action Center chose to create my position. I think within that, I built so many like relationships that it just like Elib said earlier, like it's very abundantly many blessings within being in my position. Definitely loved it. Definitely still a challenge, and I think it's amazing for me to be able to be an advocate and a representation in the rooms and go into these spaces and tell them like, wow, like you're not making this accessible enough for families who didn't go chance to either finish school, that being elementary, high school, or go to college, that you're making it seem that it's not for them when it really is. So what's the deal with that? But yeah, I think my position was able to navigate people to know, be like, hey, you're in this situation, so you need this application, or you're in this, so you need that. And I think this is a role many organizations should have, because I've been in other different rooms of different organizations that I wish they had a resource navigator that can be like, hey, you're dealing with houselessness, let's go find you a shelter or a housing attorney or something, you know? And I think that's a role many organizations should continue to have.
Thank you, Sada. That's a great example of like responding to emergent needs. As we saw, nothing was getting translated. Folks didn't have access, you know, they were trying to use their phone to fill out these FEMA forms, etc. And so to really say, oh, we need someone who's going to sit down. And so Sada's position was created. There's a couple more folks who are resource navigators right now. And just listening to Sada talk reminded me of something that I wanted to include in the slideshow that I learned partway through this work that has been such a guiding principle for me. And that was, someone told me, you know, don't just do something, stand there, right? Don't just come in with what you want to do and assume that that's what's needed. Show up, stand there, and wait until the community tells you what it is that they need. And so Sada's position really arose out of that. Oh, we need someone to help with these forms. And so that has become a huge part of the work that we're now doing in recovery, is making sure that everyone's aware of the resources that are there, making sure that those resources are accessible, and making sure that the municipalities, the county, the cities, the state is prepared for this next disaster by making sure that accessibility leads in all of this work that they're trying to do. And so this idea of don't just do something, stand there, has been so pivotal for a lot of the work that we've done.
Can I ask a question? We're mostly volunteer, like during the surge of, sometimes we can give people like little contracts and stuff. And we'd like to get more towards staff and everything, but we know that volunteers are part of our long-term structure. We have more volunteers than we can handle during surge moments when it's in the news, and we can usually get away with being, frankly, like pretty disorganized and still get a lot done. But then we feel it in the like aftermath, and you guys sustain like an 11-month operation, which is incredible. I found that volunteers like sometimes are on a spectrum of like wanting almost like a cult like family vibe of like, this is to die hard, this is like everything, this is going to solve climate everything, which we can't offer. And then also like on the other hand, like really circumscribed, like give me the specific tasks, specific shift, specific everything. And sometimes it's like in the messy in between where like we do care about each other and there are values, but there's also work to do, but it's also really messy and we can't exactly figure out, break it down into like a checklist for you. What wisdom can you offer about like offering like a long-term post-surge, post-frenzy volunteer operation?
That's a good question. And I think it actually speaks to the network that Rogue Climate specifically had built before the fires, and the volunteer network that they had mobilized in opposition to the liquid gas pipelines that were being built here in Oregon. And so they had this great network across the region and the state that they already had engaged in a really effective way. And those folks folded right into the work to begin with. And you're right, there was a big surge in the beginning. And then here we are 11 months later, and we've been relying on the same like 3 people on Wednesday. We know they're going to show up, and there's only one person who shows up on Friday. We know, and so let's try and make sure that we have an extra staff available if it's busy. And so sustaining that has been challenging, but to be honest, the way that this community in particular has shown up is pretty incredible. And I want to say that most of our volunteers are coming from Ashland, which is a very affluent community for those who don't know, compared to Talent and Phoenix, which burned down. Many of our volunteers, I would say, are mostly Karens, right? Coming to us from Ashland, from a place of privilege, and have really embraced this idea of solidarity, not charity, and have really, I've seen like the progressive movement grow within these white, affluent, middle class, upper middle class folks, which has been really cool to see. But we logged almost 15,000 hours of volunteer time at the relief site over these 11 months. It's just a phenomenal effort. And a big player in all of this work, who we haven't mentioned yet, is this woman, Maya Jared, who works for Rogue Climate. And as the volunteer coordinator, it's her masterful organizational skills that have really sustained this work in so many ways. And she was going to join us today, but with the site closing and with all the work we're doing, we're all kind of a little fried. But yeah, people hours, volunteer hours, so vital. And we were so fortunate to have this community that just continued to show up.
Thank you.
Give like a little thing on there, because just 2 things popped into my head that I think are so crucial for anything that sustains volunteers long term. And the first is like, if you have any paid staff, like the volunteer coordinator should get paid so they can do this full time. And like really good onboarding, like I love what you said about don't just do something, stand there, like take that breath to slow down and be like, if we want to sustain this over a year or multiple years, like as much as there's an emergency now, we need to be thinking like, does this set up in a way that we can sustain it? And one thing I'm just doing from organizing in general that I think is just so applicable in all of this is like, you kind of need to like, not like judge, but like assess whether someone's going to show up regularly and is kind of worth putting in that time versus being like, okay, you came to this one event, so you can pat yourself on the back and post on Facebook, have a nice day, no,
Right.
no hate, but we're not really going to put in a lot of time.
And, we organize some of our volunteer tasks that way, like, oh, it's really easy to bring stuff from the back room and put it on the shelves. And so for, it's a great introduction to what we're doing, and it'll give you a chance to, meet the community that's coming in, and we could plug people in really quickly like that. But then it's like, oh, well, who's going to drive the truck from the warehouse here? And, oh, you've been showing up and this is a great opportunity. And so growing the community was so great, and being able to give people multiple entry points into the work. I am hosting this meeting. I do have to hop off here. I am happy to pass hosting privileges off to someone else. I will go.
So we can wrap up.
Yeah, I'm going to drop my email in the chat here one more time. Please reach out for anything, any questions. The Rogue Action Center moving forward is really realizing the knowledge that we are holding, and that our experience with this work is really valuable to other communities in the West. And so we're recognizing that we want to be a resource for people. And so the position that I'm in has been funded for a couple more years. And one of the focuses of that is to be a resource regionally for other fire affected communities. So really, really please reach out. My email is right there in the chat. Oh no, it went just to Anna here. Let me switch that. And I'm really grateful to, well, to everyone, to Anna, to Jimmy, to a lot of folks in this mutual aid network that I've been able to fall into, and really have learned just so much from y'all too.
We are so grateful to you. Thank you so much to all of our presenters. Yeah, if any folks want to drop their contact info in the chat before we sign off, so I know Willam has to go. Or we have that I think we're all on the Signal thread for the most part. If you're not, we'll add you. Drop your number and we'll add you to the Signal thread if you're not. And then I think, yeah, that wraps it up. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank
Anna.
you.
It's great to meet you all.
Have a good night.
You all. Okay, got that. I'll add you. Anyone else need to get added to Signal before I click leave? Okay, that too.
I'll coordinate who wants to be on there with. Yeah, feel free to add yourself, Mask Oakland people, but we can also follow up about it. Cool.
The two
Thanks
that
so much.
put their numbers there so far. All right,
Good to meet you, Redwoods.
thank you all so much.
Yeah, we'll
Have a
talk
good